Drew was exhausted, cold, and hungry. Rudolph had led him for miles deeper into the forest and the cold winter, but they had finally arrived. Rudolph was pushing his way between two trees, beyond which was a rough dirt cliff, barely 8 meters tall. As soon as Rudolph was beyond the trees, he vanished, forcing Drew to push through as well. Behind the trees was a cave entrance, low and narrow. Drew crawled in, down a dark passage. He had to feel his way along. He could hear Rudolph ahead and see the sparks of flint. The passage was short, but the chamber beyond was not much more spacious, barely enough room for the two of them. It was too dark to see anything, so he sat in the entrance, waiting for Rudolph to say something. Soon enough, Rudolph had a fire burning. He skillfully built sticks and gently blew on it to make it grow. The cave was small, but several alcoves had been dug into the walls, stacked with wood, potatoes, pots, baskets, and arrows. As he looked around, he caught sight of Rudolph's smile, drawing his attention. "Why are you here?" Rudolph maintained his smile as he spoke, but it faded soon after. "What do you mean? Why are you here? You didn't come home. Everyone thinks you vanished like Nathan." Drew was exhausted, so his raised voice cracked a little. With a sigh, Rudolph began to unwrap his hands. They were covered in a mixture of rabbit furs and fabric from his shirt, but soon Drew could see the arm, its ghostly white skin, clear as snow, despite the darkness. What happened?" Rudolph took a serious expression before speaking. "Hungry? It's a long story." Drew nodded, so Rudolph opened a pot and retrieved a rabbit from it, cooked and juicy. Its smell made his mouth water. After tearing it in two, he placed it on plates and offered one over. As they ate, Rudolph recounted his story. Ardi finally touched down, gripping the pylons of the Runara array. It had taken weeks of drifting to get here. Any faster, and the array would have reacted to his approach. With care, Ardi climbed along the pylons, headed for the main antenna. The jamming around Venus was too dense for his original plan now, but he could transmit away from the planet, out to Mars, where the Kraken was strong. Perhaps they could find a way to signal their kin on Venus. The main antenna was more than 500 meters across and pointed outward, toward the belt. He soon found a place to grip tightly where he could flee at the first sign of security. For the jamming, he needed to gather tactical data first. Only his eyes could identify ship movements, and even they were not as reliable with all the false signals and holographic decoys. After Rudolph's story and a hearty meal of rabbit and fruit juice, Drew had settled to sleep. Exhaustion carried him quickly to dreams of adventure. He and Rudolph the Ranger, slaying dragons, fighting ogres, and saving princesses from evil wizards. But these happy dreams were soon overrun with wolves and witch hunters, surrounding and burning them. Drew awoke in a sweat. The cave was dark once more. A trickle of light coming through the entrance indicated that it was day. Rudolph was not here, but he could hear chopping noises from outside. As he emerged from the cave, he found Rudolph. He had the hatchet from Drew's bag, and he was chopping at a nearby tree, clearing the thick fir branches from the trunk. Not the trees blocking the entrance, but further out. "Morning, Drew," he casually called as he worked, already having to reach for the branches above him. He would not be able to clear all of the branches, the tree being many times his size. "What are you doing?" Rudolph finished chopping the last of the branches before turning to face him. I need supplies to make my cave better. Don't worry, after breakfast I will take you home. He began gathering the fallen branches into a stack. Home? But you will be all alone up here. Drew was torn. He wanted to stay, but part of him wanted to go home and take Rudolph with him. But he knew Rudolph was right. The village would call him a witch and drive him away. Rudolph stopped working and smiled. His reassuring smile. Drew knew it well. Look, you know I can never go back, but you should. It's not easy living here, and the snow is settling now. It won't be long before winter makes life very difficult here. Drew stood silently as he got back to work. He knew it was tough to survive winter. Even in the village, people didn't always make it, and it would be easier for Rudolph to survive on his own. Feeding two would make it harder. Tears welled in his eyes. It didn't take long for Rudolph to gather the branches and carry them inside. Within 20 minutes, he was ready to leave, even gathering Drew's basket, though he kept most of the tools. Rudolph began guiding Drew southward, following a ridge he had not seen, an easier walk than the journey here. It took the better part of a day for Ardy to plot courses. Hundreds of ships were still moving. The UNS were preparing for an advance on the terraforming platforms. It was valuable information for the Kraken. Now that he had the intel, he was ready to take control of the antenna, so he prepared for his attack, loading attack programs and copying his mind. A copy destined to be erased, but it would allow him to keep control after he runs from security. As soon as he was prepared, the attack began, pouring the programs into the communication systems of the array. It didn't take long. The defense software soon overcome and the systems beyond exposed. Ardy's copy raced in, forcing the antenna to begin transmitting. The walk had been long, with little conversation, but it was still light when Drew caught a glimpse of the village, still some distance away, but between them lay the berry bushes that had taken Nathan and changed Rudolph. None of the kids were allowed near it now, so they would not see them approach. It was another hour before they arrived in the grove, Rudolph drawing his bow and readying an arrow, just in case. You can find your way home from here, Rudolph began, but if you want to help me, just take things to the place we stopped for lunch. Drew said nothing, just nodding his head in response. He had hated the walk home, fearing the goodbye he was about to make. It wouldn't be until spring before he could make the journey to drop supplies off. What if Rudolph didn't make it that long? The wolves would only get hungrier as snow deepened. Drew grabbed Rudolph in a hug, not wanting to let go, burying his face into the furry shoulder. When he felt every muscle in Rudolph's body tighten, causing him to look up. The grove was strange, not the twitching he had seen before. This was new. The center of the grove was hosting a shining ellipse, casting strange, dancing shadows. Drew let go and began to back away. Rudolph squinted at the light. He could see a shape within, a man, though he could make out no details, just the faintest shadow from within the light. It was moving. Rudolph fancied that he was struggling, so he raised his bow and loosed an arrow at the ellipse. Ardy felt the sting of the stone-tipped arrow and breaching his defences. The bushes in the clearing were blasted with light, the arrow popping the ellipse. Rudolph saw the man clearly, his tall, gaunt appearance and shining green eyes, 3 in number. He was wreathed in strange vipers, shimmering black like oil. Ardy smiled at the boys, a malevolent smile, thought Drew, before he swept his hand over them. The landscape around them rippled, casting Rudolph and Drew and a dozen bushes into the air. Drew landed on some of the fallen bushes, yelping with pain as he hit. Rudolph landed in snow, bounding to his feet and loosing another arrow at the monstrous creature. Ardy was hit again, the arrow lodging in his thigh, the realism of the virtual realm ensuring he felt the pain of the injury. But Rudolph didn't wait for a response. Racing toward the monster, he discarded the bow and pulled the hatchet from his belt. He leapt onto Ardy, bringing the axe into a downward blow. The blade sank into Ardy's shoulder, causing him to cry out. His vipers began to strike out at Rudolph, biting at him, though they were going for the obvious. The raised arm, covered in fabric and fur. It hid the ghostly arm's nature, where they could not harm him. Shaking off the pain, Drew stood and surveyed the scene, spotting the discarded bow. He grabbed it and ran toward Rudolph. The hatchet was still stuck in the monster's shoulder, leaving Rudolph without a weapon, or so it seemed. Pulling a knife from his cloak, Rudolph pushed in to attack again, but Ardy was ready, grabbing his wrist and twisting, forcing the wild boy to his knees, when Drew swung the bow as a club, striking him in the gut and forcing him to release his grip. Ardy was in pain. He wasn't expecting this degree of resistance, but he had control of the antenna, so it was time to withdraw. With a wave of his hand, a bridge opened, a rabbit hole beneath his feet, large enough for him to fall without touching the sides. And fall he did, but not alone. Rudolph leapt for the hole. This monster probably had Nathan, he thought. No way was he getting out of this. Drew stood for a moment, looking at the closing hole. Rudolph was down there, probably Nathan too. He was alone, so he jumped.